My name is Tom Leffenchuk, and today this presentation will be exploring the middle range nursing theory of self-transcendence developed by Dr. Pamela Reed, and the social issue will be focusing in on patient self-isolation and loneliness in the inpatient setting and those suffering from chronic illness. So during this presentation, we'll explore the theory in depth, looking at the core concepts of the theory, explore the relationships between those concepts of the self-transcendence nursing theory. Theory relates directly to the social issue of patient isolation and loneliness, as the theory can give any patient a new perspective on self-care, which due to their vulnerability has caused them to retreat within themselves. We'll identify major concepts and different relationships within the theory, with the primary concept being of the dimensions of self-transcendence, which we will explore in depth a little later. We'll explain the philosophical views of different researchers, explain how exactly they apply to the theory, and lastly, we'll look into the application of the theory on a clinical level and through the use of tools specific to the self-transcendence theory. So, origin of the self-transcendence theory starts with Dr. Pamela Reed, who's a professor of nursing at the University of Phoenix in Tucson, Arizona. Did a majority of her schooling at Wayne State University, where she obtained her BSN, MSN, as well as PhD. She's known as a pioneer of nursing study at the intersection of spirituality and nursing, with her studies in mental health, self-transcendence, spiritual perspectives of patients, and overall patient care, leading to the development of this nursing theory. Redeveloped this middle range theory through three major already established perspectives in nursing theory: Martha Rogers' nursing science conceptual system, Richard Lerner's lifespan development theory, and finally Viktor Frankl's logotherapy theory. These theories will be discussed more in depth later on in the presentation. She wanted her nursing theory to focus on the well-being of patients in context of caring for them during times of difficult health-related experiences and or chronic diagnoses. The social issue that we'll be discussing throughout the presentation is twofold, both self-isolation and loneliness in patients. The focus will be on patients in the hospital setting, patients who are newly diagnosed suffering from life-changing chronic illnesses. A direct link between the social issues leads to the need to explore both issues alongside one another. In the modern era of medicine, patients have never felt more lonely and isolated, with studies showing about 1 in every 3 people suffering from loneliness in the United States alone. When a patient's hospitalized, for instance, there's a limiting access to their normal life and routine, where patients told when to eat, how to eat, when they can sleep, when tests can be conducted, in many cases are confined to a singular room for days or weeks at a time. Patients may retreat within themselves, self-isolate to cope with this, and as the isolation is something that they can't control. This self-isolation can eventually lead to loneliness of this population of patients. On the other hand, patients newly diagnosed or suffering from chronic illnesses in many cases feel a deep sense of loneliness due to the lack of understanding of their support system to what is actually happening to them on a day-to-day basis. This loneliness from both their understanding of the chronic illness and from those around them not having understanding of what the patient's going through can lead to self-isolation from their support system and the environment around them. This allows the patient to have some sort of control over their life with the illness that they are suffering from, leaves them with little to no control. There's a direct correlation between the two social issues, and that there's a lack of control over what's happening to them. The ability to control an aspect of their life leads directly to the correlation between self-isolation and loneliness. Throughout this presentation, we will see how self-transcendence theory helps patients deal with their self-isolation and loneliness and overcome these challenges in a way that can lead them to a positive outcome. So why the self-transcendence nursing theory? The self-transcendence nursing theory, middle range nursing theory, is one that can be applied to all groups of patients of all ages, from adolescents to geriatrics, new diagnoses to end-of-life care. All patients are able to be cared for under the self-transcendence nursing theory. The idea of patients who are suffering from self-isolation and loneliness is due to their vulnerability about their situation or diagnosis and have reduced sense of self-care. The self-transcendence nursing theory helps these patients through 3 major concepts: vulnerability, self-transcendence, and well-being. So starting with vulnerability, it's known as the starting point for the nursing theory, as it can have a very wide range of physical and emotional health experiences or diagnoses that can lead a patient to being vulnerable. When a patient feels vulnerable, they can retreat within themselves, block out others, for many patients, it may be simply easier to deal with the diagnosis or disease process alone. The idea of having to face the realities of their diagnosis and the changes to their lives that come with that can cause patients to go into this mode of self-isolation. Patients who self-isolate or have feelings of loneliness don't necessarily have to be suffering from chronic illness, as even potential changes or facing adversity may lead to these behaviors by patients. The goal of the theory is to find these vulnerable patients and enhance their awareness and understanding that it's okay for others to help them and reach out to others for help when needed. This can be done through the next step of the self-transcendence nursing theory, self-transcendence. So self-transcendence itself is an abstract concept that's an evolutionary trait, which for an individual enhances their awareness of their surrounding environment and themselves, leading to a deeper understanding of life. The concept of self-transcendence is seen as the process, and at its core is at the core of the overall nursing theory. We want the patient to push through those personal boundaries in meaningful ways to enhance their overall well-being. This allows for a patient who is suffering from self-isolation and loneliness to find meaning in their diagnosis and expand their personal boundaries, of which they may be uncomfortable at first, to allow others to help and support them. Self-isolating can be seen as a patient punishing themselves due to their diagnosis or other environmental factors that, through the patient exploring self-transcendence, can help tackle this issue. A patient can achieve self-transcendence through 4 different dimensions. First, starting with intrapersonal. The first step of the self-transcendence has the patient look within oneself to find their inner values and beliefs. This is thought as a patient looking inward gives a person time to self-reflect upon their situation. This step is not always positive, can be difficult for patients to handle, as those who are self-isolated or lonely are already looking inward and in many ways looking for reasoning to why they are already in their current situation. Step 2 would be the interpersonal. This step has the patient look outward, where the patient will move on from their isolation, make those person-to-person or interpersonal connections with other people and or the environment around them. This step can be done by the patient being altruistic, where they're thinking of the well-being of others, being before themselves, and having a concern for others as well. When someone has been isolated or lonely, having them connect with others and building relationships is important for the success of the theory. This requires the patient to step out of their comfort zone, leading to the next dimension, which would be the temporal dimension. Temporal dimension for any patient is one of the most important dimensions, as it's seen as moving upwardly, where the patient will put behind their past bad experiences or what future losses they might find and find a meaning of living in the moment. This dimension can be seen as one that is of growth and development within the theory. It's important for patients to know that there may be setbacks within this dimension, and the goal of the dimension is simply to keep moving towards a goal of self-care and overall well-being. The fourth and final dimension would be the transpersonal dimension. It's the final dimension within the nursing theory, where the patient will move beyond themselves and connect with nature or a greater force. During this dimension, focusing on helping to facilitate the patient's spiritual beliefs and help them foster hope about their disease process and help break the patient out of their self-isolation and loneliness. The final overall concept of the self-transcendence theory is the patient reaching a state of well-being, which is described in a broad sense as the patient's subjective feeling of well-being and healthy. Well-being of a patient is known as the outcome of the self-transcendence middle range theory and is one of the more interesting concepts, as for every patient, the state of well-being can be different from their own point of view and can be different from a provider's point of view. It's the patient's internal feeling of what being all right is, even in time. It's the patient's internal feeling of being all right, even in times of what their physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual health may be lacking. Well-being is the ultimate goal of the self-transcendence nursing theory, where moving through each dimension will eventually lead to a final feeling of well-being for the patient. Core relationship for this theory is based on the seen above image, which is vulnerability in a patient leads to self-transcendence, leading to the overall well-being for the patient. As I mentioned before, the goal of the self-transcendence theory is to get the patient to a overall state of well-being, and self-transcendence can be seen as a type of mediator between vulnerability and well-being. Taking the patient's vulnerable state, allowing for the patient to feel vulnerability through self-reflection and transcendence can help motivate the patient to participate and have a better time potentially coping with their vulnerability, thus leading to a patient's well-being. The relationship between vulnerability and well-being can be described as an inverse relationship, where a patient's vulnerability is high, their well-being is normally low, and when a vulnerability is low, the well-being is typically high. Self-transcendence mediates this relationship, and even when a vulnerability can be high, patients can still have a successful outcome in their well-being state. Looking at the self-transcendence middle range theory through the lens of the philosophical views, theories such as Martha Rogers' conceptual system look at the theory from a holistic point of view. The theory goes on to explain that people are energy fields who are in constant exchange with the environment around them. Rogers explains that there's no physical barrier separating oneself from the environment around them, and ties directly into the self-transcendence theory, where we self-reflect and attempt to repattern ourselves through the dimensions mentioned earlier. Rogers explains that the repatterning of a patient's energy fields can open them up, allowing for all four dimensions of the self-transcendence theory to be applicable to patients suffering from self-isolation and loneliness. The next theory, Richard Lerner's lifespan developmental theory, is based on the idea of essentially what it states, the constant development and growth of a person throughout their life. A person is constantly in development over the course of their life and remains malleable or open to enhancing themselves over the course of their lifetime. The idea of self-isolation and loneliness may signify that this change has diminished or in some cases halted, and the self-transcendence theory looks to strengthen support systems in the environment around the patient through the development of self that Lerner explains. The final theory here is Viktor Frankl's logotherapy nursing theory, in which the patient will search for meaning in their life. Logotherapy theory also looks for not only meaning, but fulfillment of this meaning, and when this meaning or fulfillment isn't met, the patient can be in what's known as an existential vacuum. So under Frankl, the vacuum manifested itself, in our case, as self-isolation and loneliness, where the patient has retreated within themselves and have lost the fulfillment and meaning due to their diagnosis. Logotherapy theory provides an existential foundation for the self-transcendence theory and uses the four dimensions to bring the patient out of their state of self-isolation and loneliness, providing them with the framework to have connections with oneself and create and have experiences with others, breaking that existential vacuum. When looking at application of the self-transcendence nursing theory, it's important as providers to create and foster an environment in which the patient has the best chance of achieving self-transcendence and well-being. Primary principles to abide by are to initially acknowledge their vulnerability and ensure the patients feel validated in why they are self-isolating and are suffering from feelings of loneliness. This allows us as providers to build trust with the patient and give them the framework to allow them to change. Including the four dimensions of self-transcendence is a great way to provide a pathway to well-being while shifting focus from their isolation and loneliness, which is known as a deficit, and focus on their dimensions of transcendence. Examples of self-journaling encourages self-reflection that can help break the cycle of self-isolation and loneliness, providing the patient with a sense of self-worth that isn't necessarily tied to their current illness. Promoting the connection with others, as mentioned on an earlier slide, can help combat the feelings of loneliness as it shifts the patient from a passive feeling, such as self-doubt or feeling like a burden to others, to giving the patient a purpose in helping others. Having the patient reflect on their life, look to a potential future, can reduce feelings of isolation that may define them as a person. Encouraging connection to a spiritual or higher power can further reduce those feelings of isolation and lead a patient to feeling of spiritual well-being. The idea of connectedness has been seen in recent studies as to be fundamental in the well-being, health, and healing of a patient, and is seen as a holistic approach to the self-transcendence process. Measurement of the self-transcendence middle range nursing theory is used various instruments to measure self-transcendence throughout the lifespan of the theory. Most common instrument developed is the self-transcendence scale, which was developed as a unidimensional instrument with 15 measured points on a 4-point Likert type scaling. This demonstrated both reliability and validity across multiple studies of various populations and health experiences of patients, and is seen as the gold standard for self-transcendence scaling or testing. Testing is brief, concise, with testing taking only a few minutes to complete and focus on the four dimensions of the self-transcendence, where differentiation between answers of the four dimensions is important clinically, theoretically, and scientifically in how patients are cared for. We can see by the picture above the self-transcendence scale and how concise, able to be done quickly and scored immediately. We can do it by the time I'm done with this slide. Scoring is simple. The higher the score, the higher the level of self-transcendence. Each question relates to a different dimension of the self-transcendence. For example, question 2 relating to intrapersonal dimension and question 3 relating to interpersonal dimension. With this model, it's not uncommon for patients to score high in one dimension and lower in others. So as providers, we must treat patients accordingly. Clinical application of the self-transcendence middle range theory has been touched upon throughout the presentation. I'll go over some points that I've already made. I wanted to touch on them directly in this slide to show and explain how the self-transcendence theory can help a wide range of patients in different settings who all can be suffering from self-isolation and loneliness. A common use of the self-transcendence theory would be in the patient population at the end of their life or currently on palliative care services. Many times these patients are acutely vulnerable, where they have feelings of existential dread or impending doom or fear of the unknown for what comes next for them. Encouraging through the interpersonal dimension the idea of life review and looking inwardly at the current situation. The transpersonal dimension can give the patient spiritual clarity and help them reach a higher power and help reach a level of self-transcendence, in turn bringing them out of their self-isolation and loneliness through spirituality. The primary focus throughout this presentation has been on patients diagnosed with some sort of chronic illness. And so some of this may sound familiar from earlier slides, but in the clinical setting, patients are diagnosed with life changing chronic diseases such as cancer, asthma, diabetes every single day, and will have to change the way that they live their life, and significantly in many cases. For some patients, this again leads to the self isolation and loneliness aspect of their illness due to the rapid changes, loss of way of life, and lack of understanding from those around them, leading to self isolation and loneliness. Using tools like self transcendence scale, we as providers can assess the patient's level of self transcendence and see exactly which dimensions they can improve upon and help them adapt to these changes that they are facing. Much like with the end of life in palliative care, having patient look inward and have self acceptance of their new diagnoses and changes, not allowing this diagnosis to define the rest of their lives, looking through the temporal dimension and living in the moment can show how they can live, how they can live prior to the illness and give the patient the confidence and resilience to push through the self isolation and loneliness and continue to live that way. On our final clinical application, geriatric and long-term care patients are going to be some of the most common patients that we will come across as providers. These patients have some of the most at-risk patients. These patients are some of the most at-risk patients for self-isolation and loneliness, with the loss of friends and family around them, feeling like a burden on what family they have left due to their loss of function with age. And in many cases, these patients simply keeping to themselves may be easier than asking for help. It's important to reestablish a sense of purpose for these patients, encouraging the interpersonal dimension of the self-transcendence theory, giving them options such as mentoring others or encouraging them to attend support groups and get along with their peers. Much like previous clinical applications, self-acceptance is a primary factor in the self-transcendence, as aging is simply a fact of life. We all age and we will slowly lose certain functions, and coming to terms with this fact can cause self-isolation and can be quite lonely. Accepting this fact of aging and can allow the patient to explore other dimensions of the self-transcendence and lead them to an overall state of well-being. So in conclusion, it brings us to the conclusion of our presentation on Paul Reed's self-transcendence theory with a focus on patient self-isolation and loneliness. The goal for this presentation was to show how as a provider, we can help patients get to the level of well-being and break patients from their self-isolation and loneliness through the use of the self-transcendence middle-range nursing theory. Identifying the reasoning for the patient's vulnerability, using the dimensions of the self-transcendence, and bringing patients to a state of well-being is at its most simple, the self-transcendence theory. Self-isolation and loneliness are difficult social issues to identify and quantify. For some patients, the state of self-isolation and loneliness may be what they consider to be their state of well-being. As we mentioned earlier, well-being is subjective. It's a subjective state differing from person to person, and ensuring that the patient has the proper framework, proper implementation of the theory, can hopefully help lead them to a state of well-being that leads them out of self-isolation and loneliness. Thank you all so much for your time, and then here's my reference sheet.